Thank you. All right. Can I maybe first get a show of hands? How many people have already heard of the IoT security verification standard? Good, 1, 2. Okay. Cool. And anyone interested in IoT security who hasn't heard of that standard yet? Okay, good. Nice. All right. So, very quickly, who am I? My CV is a lot shorter than the previous guys that presented, I'm afraid. So I'm a pen tester. I work at Untitled, who is a Belgian cybersecurity consultancy firm. But when I showed the slides to my manager for review, he said, "Oh, Theo, you have to say that you're a security expert." So, okay, cybersecurity expert. And my focus is on IoT ecosystem and embedded device assessments. So that's about half of what I do. And the other half is R&D, but mostly on the methodology and the tools we used to test IoT ecosystems at Untitled. And I've also contributed to the OWASP Isvs, and this is why I'm here today to talk to you about it. So, I'm going to start with why. Why do we need the Isvs? And this was basically the situation when I started at Untitled. I hope you recognize that picture from the previous talk. Cool. All right. That saves me the need to explain it as well. But when I started pen testing at Untitled 4 years ago, and I started at the IoT department, I was also doing some web pen tests and some mobile pen tests. And while for web and mobile, the methodology was very mature. Why? Because it was based on the OWASP standards, like the MISVS, for example. For IoT, it was a bit more the Wild West. So we still had a methodology which was based largely on the experience of the people that were working there before me and that were experts in that field. So we had a very nice, internal methodology, but it wasn't structured and mature in a way that the other OWASP standards were. So as a tester, I really wanted something that's standardized, like a standardized list of controls for IoT assessments in order to have consistent quality, right? Every assessment we do is kind of the same and we cover the same points. To help also perform QA on our assessments and know that everything was covered, and also help new testers like me gain confidence in testing IoT environments and gain the knowledge needed to perform this kind of tests. So this is why we wanted a new standard from the tester's perspective. But the ISVS, the idea behind it was to be useful for more than testers, right? Another kind of pain point we identified were developers. And in my 4 years of pen testing IoT, this is kind of my top 3 of findings I see. This is not an official list. It's not based on the OWASP IoT top 10, for example. But I really saw the same findings come again and again in assessments. So, for example, missing authentication on hardware interfaces. They built a very nice device, and when you open it up, you have a JTAG interface, you just plug your cable, and then you start interfacing with the CPU, and you do whatever you want on the device. Or you have a very nice, very advanced cloud infrastructure to support your application, and you have your MQTT broker, and there you don't think about authorization. So any device can write to any topic, and it's a bingo story for the attacker. You can impersonate anything you want. Another classic one, reuse of credentials, right? So all the credentials on all the devices are the same. You compromise one device, every device in the ecosystem is compromised. So we kept seeing the same mistakes again and again and again. So we thought it would be super nice to be able to give to developers a very clear set of security requirements that's applicable to any kind of IoT ecosystem or application, instead of giving them this kind of thing and letting them figure it out. And yeah, hopefully this would allow them to avoid common errors during the development process. And a last thing, and that's also the previous talk, hopefully if you were paying attention, you know what procurement is. So it would be nice to have a tool to easily, during the procurement process, come up with requirements for IoT solutions. For example, let's say you have an awesome idea about an IoT application, but you want a third party to develop it. It would be nice to have an easy interface with a third party to tell them, look, for security, I want the thing that you will build for me to adhere to this, and this requirement, right? So it would be very nice to have something to cover those three requirements, to help testers test IoT environments, to help developers develop secure IoT applications, and to help with procurement. And that something is the OWASP Isvs. So this is the official definition. The OWASP Internet of Things Security Verification Standard is a community effort to establish an open standard of security requirements for Internet of Things applications. The requirements provided by the ISVs can be used at many stages during the product development lifecycle, including design, development, and testing of IoT applications. So it's basically the kind of the cousin or the little brother, little sister of the ASVS or the MISVS, but for IoT. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to go with you a bit over the history of this project, because it's a quite new OWASP project. So explain a bit how it started, show you the people behind it. I already spoiled it a bit because my presentation view is broken, so I don't know what's coming next. Explain to you the structure, the philosophy behind it, and then give you a very quick sneak peek at some of the requirements. So I'm not going to go into the detail and show you the complete list. I think there's about 100 requirements in there, but I'm going to give you some examples to hopefully prove to you that it's useful. These are the people who started this project and who are currently leading it. So you have Aaron, who is a senior security leader at Cisco, and he's also project leader for a lot of IoT-related OWASP projects. So you have the IoT Goat, which is a vulnerable IoT application that people can hack to learn about IoT security, the firmware analysis project, and of course the OWASP ISVs. And then you have Cedric, who is a colleague of mine at Enviso, and he's responsible for our IoT and embedded device application security services at Enviso. So those are the two people that got into a room, basically, or probably a Teams meeting, a couple of years ago, and came up with the idea to kickstart this OWASP project. And this is how it started. That was back in January 2020. It just started as a Google Sheets, basically, where a few people had access, and the idea was to make an initial run, so gather an initial bunch of requirements that would then be opened to the community, just to have a base, just not to ask everyone, okay, contribute whatever you want, just to have a vision, a structure to the project. So I was lucky enough to have like an inside view on that part, to be one of the people that reviewed the initial list of requirements. And that went on for about a year. And in December 2020, this moved to GitHub. It also opened to the public with what we call the pre-release or the release candidate 1.0. So this was 2 years ago, almost. This is where we are now. We're still In the release candidate version, as you can see, there were a lot of issues that were opened by the community with respect to the requirements in the Isvs. And we are basically progressively working on closing those issues, on refining the requirements, and working towards the first major release, which will hopefully come in 2022. That's the goal, at least. So let's get a closer look at what's behind the scenes of the Isvs, how it's structured. If you're familiar with the structure of the AISVS or the MISVS, there is no surprises here. So it's structured in chapters. We have 5 chapters, and the structure is basically, it follows very closely what has been done in the MISVS and the ASVS. And for every chapter, of course, we have sections. And I mentioned there are 5 chapters, and the idea behind the structure of the chapters is to have a bit like a stack. So you have it's a bit confusing because the numbers are inversed. So you have chapter number 5, who is on the left here. It's the hardware platform. Why? Because when you're building an IoT application, you're going to build it on some hardware. So there you only have one section that's design, and I'm going to explain why that is later. But you have your hardware, and then on top of that, you build your software platform. You have your bootloader, you have your OS, you have your kernel, you integrate with other security chips, etc. So we have the hardware, we have the OS, then we build the communication layer. So there you need requirements for example, TLS communication and for different communication technologies, Bluetooth, Zigbee, Wi-Fi, LoRaWAN, etc. And on top of that, you build your applications. So for the application, we need requirements for authentication, authorization, registration, data protection, cryptography, etc. And then on top of all this stack, we have the entire IoT ecosystem, right? And there we go to things like ecosystem design, secure development, supply chain, etc. And there's where a lot of the links with other OWASP projects happen. So for example, if in the environment you have a web application, then there's going to be a link to the OWASP ISVS. It's not the job of the ISVS to tell you how to test a web application in the IoT ecosystem, for example. And we also have the familiar concept of different levels. And there's 3 levels, as in the other OWASP verification standards. They're just defined a bit differently, because now we're dealing with IoT and hardware. So we have level 1. Level 1 is hack attacks. By the way, those are not the official names. This is just the names I like to use for the different levels. If you look at the standard, it's just level 1, level 2, level 3. But so level 1 is kind of the baseline, and it's not looking at hardware at all. It's looking at attackers who are attacking the software. So for example, from the network, you have a smart light bulb, and with the attacker standing on the network, they cannot touch the device, but they can attack the software stack of the device. So that's level 1, and it's suitable for devices or applications that don't have any intellectual property to protect, or they don't have any sensitive data on them. And then you go to level 2, which starts looking at relatively simple hardware attacks for devices where physical compromise should be avoided. For example, to protect intellectual property and sensitive data on the device. An example of a relatively simple hardware attack is opening the device up and dumping the flash memory of the device, for example, to recover sensitive information. And an example of a device that should be covered by, okay, I didn't break it, of a level 2 of ISVS is a smart lock, which is a bit more sensitive already than a smart bulb, but it's not something super critical. And And then we have level 3, the lab attacks, what I call the lab attacks at least, which aims to cover more sophisticated hardware attacks. So, for example, glitching, high channel attacks, and it's appropriate for devices that have highly sensitive data on them, or when compromise can result in fraud. For example, a crypto wallet. So we have the chapters. Chapters are divided in sections. And then each section has requirement, and each requirement has different levels. And the last thing we need to look at before we start looking at the contents of the standard itself is what is kind of the philosophy behind it. So the Isvs looks at the IoT application as a whole. It looks at the ecosystem. It looks at the different communication flows between the components of the ecosystem. It looks at application and operating system security. It looks at the integration with the hardware platform. But that's where we draw the line, and that's where the scope of the Isvs stops. And that's the hardware. So we don't consider that generally it's the responsibility of the developer to verify the security of the hardware itself. That's generally the responsibility of the manufacturer, and it's generally something that's covered by hardware certification. So this part is considered out of scope, and if that's not super clear, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm also going to give you your first look at some of the requirements that are inside the Isvs. This is from Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is hardware security, and as I told you, there is only one section, design, exactly because of the reasons that I explained regarding the philosophy of the Isvs. So, for example, if you look at number 511, it reads, verify that the platform supports disabling or protecting access to debugging interface, JDEC, SWT, UART. And 2 is verify that the platform supports validating the authenticity of the first stage bootloader. If that doesn't speak to you, this refers to, for example, a secure boot system for the platform. So notice that it doesn't say verify that secure boot has been implemented correctly by the hardware, or verify that your hardware correctly does secure boot while loading or something like that. It really aims to enable developers to select a hardware platform that supports their security needs. Okay, so this was just an example of requirements. I'm going to give you some more examples later. And then finally, every chapter is supported by references. I think here I was having a very interesting discussion with the previous speaker, Rob, during the break. I think this is an obvious point where the Isvs could integrate, for example, with OpenCRE, and instead of references like that, we could have a reference to CRE. And there you go. You have one more standard integrated. But, okay, that's something for the future. All right. If you have any questions about the general structure of the Isvs, you can shout them at me right now or at the end. Otherwise, I'm going to go on and give you a couple of examples of requirements inside the Isvs. So don't worry, I know we're all tired. I'm not going to show you all the requirements inside. I'll try to make it interesting. I have a couple of examples, and then we're going to see how we can secure them using the Isvs. That's the idea. All right, so this is an article I found. It's from 2017. I know it's kind of old, but it was super complete, and it came with a technical report that explained all the vulnerabilities that they're talking about in this article. So this is why I'm using it as an example. So if you look at the headline, it reads, a recent report from security firm Widescope describes more than 8,600 flows in pacemaker systems and the third-party libraries that power various components of the devices. Sounds interesting, sounds deadly. And just to help you understand what kind of ecosystem we're talking about, you have the design there. You basically have 4 components in this kind of ecosystem. You have the pacemaker device, which goes inside the patient. You have a programmer that physicians use to change the parameters of a pacemaker. You have a home monitoring system that can interface with a pacemaker and then send data to the cloud so that physicians can have real-time access to the pacemaker data if needed. And then you have the supporting infrastructure around, for example, the cloud, the backend that receives all that data. So what I want you to think about is what could go wrong in this scenario. And yeah, maybe the question should be what couldn't go wrong. Yeah. If you have any ideas, you can shout them at me. Yeah, that's a good example of something that could go wrong. Yeah. Any other shouts? Yeah, so like authentication when you're sending controls. Yeah. Okay, you're going to see that almost everything went wrong in this scenario. So I'm going to start from the bottom, basically going through the chapters of the Isvs. In chapter 1, we have the entire ecosystem, and in this case, the supply chain of this thing was broken. So the researchers saw that there were over 8,000 known vulnerabilities in third-party components that were integrated in the applications that were running on the pacemakers. So how would the Isvs prevent that? Well, if you look at chapter 1, which is about the ecosystem requirements, it has different objectives, so secure design, supply chain management, secure building environments, and logging and monitoring. And if we zoom in the supply chain requirements, I'm not going to read all of them, but you can check the first two if you want. So, for example, the first one, verify that each application in the ecosystem maintains a software bill of materials. And the previous talks, we already saw the importance of having a software bill of materials. Cataloging third-party components, versioning, and published vulnerabilities. And number 2, verify that potential areas of risk that come with the use of third-party and open-source software have been identified and that actions to mitigate them have been taken. So if those pacemakers had been developed using this set of requirements or tested using this set of requirements, hopefully something like this wouldn't have happened. Another example, identification and authentication. So the researchers found out that pacemaker programmers did not authenticate to the pacemaker devices themselves, and also physicians didn't need to authenticate to the programmers. Basically, what that means is that anyone could buy a programmer online and then use it to program any pacemaker around. So if I reprogram your pacemaker with bad parameters, then you, yes. So not good. So how does the Isvs deal with that? It deals with that in chapter 2, which is about user space application requirements. Again, we have different objectives, notably authentication, authorization, protection of sensitive data, and crypto. So if we zoom in at the requirements, again, there's a lot of them. Not going to read all of them. But for example, if you look at 2.1.3, verify that strong user and device authentication is enforced across the IoT ecosystem. Verify that there is no default credentials. Verify that credentials are not hard-coded in firmware or ecosystem applications, etc., etc. Nothing too surprising there. And one of the last things that was broken in my pacemaker ecosystem example is the update mechanism. So the firmware was not cryptographically signed, and basically the pacemakers accepted any firmware from the programmers. So again, if you upload a malicious firmware to a pacemaker, then it's not good news for the patient, probably. So how do we cover that in the Isvs? It's covered in chapter 3, which is about the software platform requirements. And there, the control objectives cover boot trustworthiness, so secure boot, best security practices for the OS, the kernel, all the software components, and there is a section on updating and maintaining software. So, for example, if we look at that section for software updates, we have 343, verify that updates are cryptographically signed by trusted source, and their authenticity is verified before execution. And if you develop with that in mind, then you don't have any more unsigned firmware that can be uploaded to your devices. Yeah, some more examples here of the same section. All right, and that was my first example of the IoT, of the pacemaker ecosystem. I have one more example. This one is more recent, published in 2021. So you have those researchers that basically took 32 IoT devices and monitored their TLS communications for a couple of years. And they did passive attacks, so just sniffing and seeing what's going on with TLS in the network, but also active attacks, trying to man in the middle the TLS communications of those devices. And they found that most devices are vulnerable in one or more ways. So again, I want you to think what could go wrong with TLS when implementing TLS on an IoT device. Yes, in general, yeah, but any specific attacks in mind? Yeah, man in the middle is a good example. So this is what the researcher found. A lot of devices used insecure protocol versions, but even worse than that, insecure cipher suits. Notably lack of certificate validation, which means that the device would accept any certificates that didn't really care who signed it or if it was signed at all. And also poor maintenance of the device root store, which means that they found some compromised CA certificates in the root stores of the devices. And what does that give in practice? This makes this kind of scenarios possible. So you have your IoT device here. This is directly from the article. So they give the example of a Belkin smart plug. You have your backend and you want to intercept the communications. And so you're the attacker. You use your own self-signed certificate. The device accepts it because it doesn't bother to verify the authenticity of the certificates. And then you can man in the middle of the communication. And in fact, this is something very crucial in IoT devices to get right, because if you think about testing a browser or a mobile application, you have control over them. So you can make them trust the certificate of your burp proxy, for example, or I should say ZAP proxy, no burp. So you can make them trust the certificate of your proxy, and then you can intercept the communications and see what's in there and understand what exactly is the protocol that they're talking with the server. However, if you think about an IoT application, an IoT device, right, like a light bulb, there you cannot do that, right? You cannot force the device to trust your certificate, except if you have some other kind of access to the device. But there it's already game over. So it's super important that the device verifies the validity of the certificate that you're giving it, because if it does that correctly, then it's very, very hard for the attacker to intercept the communications. So this is covered in chapter 4 of the Isvs, communication requirements. So chapter 4 has a part about general requirements, which basically say, okay, first of all, use encryption, and then preferably TLS, if it's a protocol that's supported by TLS, and then configure your TLS correctly. And then the next sections are protocol specific. So they have requirements about Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, LoRaWAN, etc. And this is an example of the general requirements, and I think it's exactly what I told you. So verify that all communications occur over a secure channel, and then if TLS is used, verify that TLS is configured correctly. And yeah, since I've already showed you what's in Chapter 5, which is about hardware, this basically covers the entire ISVS, the 5 section. So my last point is about testing with the ISVS, because it's very nice to have a list of security requirements, but then you practically need to have a way to test using them. So I can attest that they're all verifiable. They were made with that in mind, as are the requirements in the MISVS and the ASVS. So they all start with verify that, and then a very concrete thing to verify. But there's a bad news, good news. Bad news is that the ISVS doesn't currently come with testing guides, like the MISVS and the ASVS do. But the good news is that all the resources are there and the tools that you need, and practically for every control that's covered in the ISVS. So first of all, there is some IoT OWASP projects that can be very helpful when you're testing IoT security and if you're using the ISVS. I already mentioned them at the beginning because Aaron, who is the project lead for this project, is also the project lead for those projects. So you have the IoT Goat, which is a vulnerable IoT application. You have the firmware analysis project, the firmware analysis testing methodology, just some examples. But then, just to try to convince you that you have tools for basically everything, every control you can think of. If you look at the controls that talk about bootloader security and secure storage of firmware, let's say you open up a device and you want to dump the firmware that's on the device. Usually that's stored on a flash chip inside the device. So there you have a tool, open source. It's called FlashRAM. And as you can see, it's for identifying, reading, writing, and erasing flash chips. So super easy. And you're going to say, but I don't know how to use it. There's a million tutorials already. This is the first one I find completely random that explains how to dump SPI flash memory of embedded devices, for example. If you want to take a closer look at MQTT communications and MQTT security, this is a tool we developed at Inviso. It's called IOXI, and the idea was to have it be like ZAP, but for MQTT communications. So something to very easily intercept MQTT communications, but also change their context, change the payload, change the topic, and try to mess with the authentication and the authorization of MQTT. Last example, if you're testing ZigBee, you have this framework. It's called KillerBee. And it basically implements all the possible ZigBee attacks that you might want to try on a device. And so using those, you can very easily cover the ISVS requirements for ZigBee. And there's many other tools. So if you're looking at HTTPS communication from the device to its backend, you have ZAP and the orange one that I won't mention again. You have for network communication Wireshark, you have Mitten Proxy, you have Binwalk for analyzing firmware, you have specialized hardware. Here I have the example of the JTAGulator, which is used to identify JTAG interfaces on embedded devices. You even have, like we have Kali OS, for example, in web pen testing and infrastructure pen testing. You have OSs like Adify OS, which has tools specialized for IoT pen testing. So all the tools are out there. And I'm almost at the end. My last slide is about the future of the ISVS. And the future is very simple. The goal is to have a next major release in 2022, which will integrate all the feedback that the community left, all the issues that were opened. So the goal is to basically apply at least 90% of that feedback, close most of the issues, and then we are ready for the next major release. And then how does the future look? Well, hopefully the requirements will continue to be refined by the community, because this is a community project. Hopefully by you guys, if you're interested. Hopefully there's going to be a testing guide that will go side by side with the Isvs and will help new testers getting into IoT pen testing to have one place where all the where how to test every requirement is explained, basically, and then mappings with other standards. But there, I think the open CRE way is basically maybe the best way to go there, integrated with something like that project, and then magically it's mapped to everything. So yeah, that was all from me.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the quality of your presentation.
Sure.
I would just like to know about the levels in the ISVs. Are they similar to the ones on the ASVS or MBSVS, or they are specific to the IoT, I would say, environments or frameworks?
The concept behind them is similar. They have the same purpose, but the kind of change is that in the ISVS you have this difference between software and hardware attacks, whereas in the other standards it's just about the criticality of the application. But yeah, basically the concept is the same.
All right. Any other question?
I didn't pay attention to the other question because I was looking up something. So I hope it doesn't repeat it. But there's a European common criteria for embedded software products. Did you look into that?
Can you...
European common criteria for embedded software products?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with those. So I hope the people who started it...
But we'll have to do the CRE mapping.
Yes. Yeah. No, I definitely think it's an interesting. It's interesting to integrate with other standards, and our goal is to move away from all this fragmented landscape. So if we can get standards together and working together, that's the ultimate goal, right? Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much then.